Hey everybody, thanks for joining us for Making the Grade. So Kevin and I were just talking before we came on about how much longer the legislature is going to be in session, because the biggest issue in education still has not really been addressed, and that's the funding formula.
We're just barely starting hearings on this, and it's been a turbulent couple of days of committee action on this. Just to briefly recap where we have been these past 3 days. So Monday morning, the Senate State Affairs Committee introduces a version of the funding formula bill.
First of all, before I let you go any further on that,
yes.
Why is it not coming out of an education committee? Can you give a little political civics lesson? So
the Senate State Affairs Committee is what is known as a privileged committee in State House lingo. And what that means is this is one of only a few committees that can introduce bills late in the session. The idea is that you want to sort of funnel the process and kind of narrow it down so that you don't have committees introducing a whole lot of legislation way late in the legislative session when there's no chance of it really passing.
That makes sense. So they're a privileged committee.
Right, it's sort of a traffic process, I guess you could say. Senate Education Committee is not a privileged committee, so to get a bill introduced, Senate Education had to go into Senate State Affairs and say, will you print this bill? Will you introduce this bill? That's what happened at 8 a.m. Monday morning. At 8:30 Monday morning, the House Education Committee, which can print bills, met to talk about a different version of the funding formula bill. Now, like I say, House Education can print bills. They didn't. They decided to vote the bill down. They didn't even formally introduce it. They returned it to the sponsor, who happens to be the chairman of the committee, Lance Clough from Twin Falls. So that bill died, and that left the one Senate bill introduced on Monday as the one and only funding formula bill that's out in the public realm. So, well, that's obsolete now because on Wednesday morning, Senate State Affairs was asked to introduce a rewritten version of the bill that they had introduced 2 days earlier. So a couple of changes, some modifications, new funding formula bill introduced on Wednesday. That is now the funding formula bill that's in play. It would still have to go back now to the Senate Education Committee for a hearing. Then it would have to go to the Senate floor, and if all that happens, then it goes over to the House. So there's a lot of maneuvering and a lot of, if you're wondering when the public gets a chance to speak out on this issue, that chance could come in the next few days when Senate Education gets a hearing on this bill. That would be the first real public hearing on a funding formula bill. Yeah, late in the game, the process is starting to unfold, but it's been a very turbulent and unpredictable couple of days.
And could all this just go away, Kevin? In the long run, could they just decide, you know, it's too much, too late, put it on the back burner and not do anything with it?
Well, possibly, very possibly, in fact. When legislative leaders met with the media on Tuesday for kind of their annual Q&A session, Scott Bedke, the Speaker of the House, said again that he doesn't think that the funding formula issue is an issue that's going to keep the legislature in town into April, that there's going to come to a point in time where the legislature may decide to not pursue the issue further. And that's coming from somebody in Speaker Bedke, who has spent 3 years on this issue.
He's passionate
He's very passionate about it. He was on the legislative committee that's been studying this issue for 3 years. He's invested a lot of time and political capital in trying to get something done here. So for him to say, you know, we don't have to do this year. I mean, there could come a point where April rolls around and we just decide not to pursue this further. It's, as we've talked about before, it's very different than Medicaid expansion that the legislature is going to have to address one way or the other. Funding formula, the legislature doesn't have to address it one way or the other. So yes, to your point, we could get to the stage at some point in the next few days, next couple of weeks, who knows when, that the folks who've been pushing for this bill say we've gone about as far as we can this year. Let's, you know, let's put a pin in it and see where we go in 2020.
Stay tuned. We'll bring you the latest updates.
Right, and it, like I say, it has changed daily, almost hourly. We'll have updates as things change. So just follow us at idahoednews.org. We'll try to have the latest comings and goings on this issue, because it's to
There
call
are
it a moving
comings and goings.
target is an understatement.
That is so true, and has been
Yeah.
all legislative session.
Absolutely.
So let's go to the opposite side. A piece of legislation that literally sailed through the House, sailed through the Senate, and is now poised for the governor's signature is one of his, Governor Brad Little's, key signature pieces of legislation, and that's going to increase beginning teacher pay.
Right, and this goes back, in Little's case, it goes back to a campaign promise that he was making more than a year ago, saying that he feels that the state needs to boost beginning teacher salaries to $40,000. Well, the bill is headed to his desk after passing the Senate unanimously on Tuesday with very little debate. I think I was there, I was watching my little clock in the corner of my laptop. It took him 8 minutes to approve this bill, which will soon become law now in the next few days, that will affect minimum teacher salaries across the state. It will affect salaries for hundreds of teachers across the state over the course of 2 years. That minimum salary, which right now is $35,800, it will boost up to $40,000
Over the next 2 years.
Over the next couple of years, yes.
It's got to, I mean, we talked about it last week on Making the Grade, but that's a big win for the governor, and to have it passed unanimously as well, and with such little debate in both houses. It's impressive.
It's a win for the governor, and I think it's also a recognition at the legislature that the concerns about a teacher shortage, that this concern about teacher recruitment and retention is a real thing, and that legislators in urban Idaho and rural Idaho alike are hearing it, and they're concerned about it. They're concerned that, especially for rural districts, and especially for districts that are
on the
border
borders.
communities, bordering Oregon or Washington or Wyoming, especially those three states that do offer higher teacher salaries. This is a legitimate concern and a chronic issue for schools. One of the things that came up in the debate, such as it was on Tuesday, was that this doesn't solve all of the state's problems in terms of teacher recruitment and retention, that you still have to address salaries on the higher end of the scale. But addressing that front end of the scale and sending a message to new teachers, to college students who are considering whether to go into education and whether to go into education in Idaho, that you need to send a message, you need to send a signal. And I think legislators across party lines and in both houses recognize this is an important message that they feel like the state needed to send this year.
So the legislators definitely sending that message. Meanwhile, just yesterday, voters sending a very different message across the state when it came to bond proposals in particular. Levies, for the most part, passed, supplemental levies, most of which have already been in place.
Yes.
But let's talk specifically about Valley View School District, because this was not a big win for them in terms of the number of votes, but a big win in terms of what they need to do with this capital. Right.
So a couple of takeaways here. Valley View was the largest bond issue on the ballot across the entire state last night. It's about a $65 million proposal in Valley View to address overcrowding at the middle schools.
They need a new middle school.
They need a new middle school, and one of their existing middle schools is, I think it's 48 years old, and it needs an overhaul as well. This is one of the faster growing districts in the state. You only need to drive around that part of Canyon County, and you can see the growth, you can see the residential growth, you can see how that translates into student growth. So Valley View goes to the polls, they seek a bond issue. It passed, it got that 2/3 supermajority by 3 votes.
That's tight.
We say it over and over, and I think viewers and readers tune out the idea that every vote counts. Well, in this case, if you're in the Valley View School District, every vote really did count, because a couple of votes one way or the other, and a $65 million proposal, the outcome could be entirely different for a very large proposal for a district that is facing some real crowding issues. This may not be the last chapter. An election that close, it may be subject to a recount.
I was going to
ask.
Not
exactly sure how the recount process goes for school elections. I know when we're talking about a state election, like a legislative race, that there's an automatic recount. I'm not sure. I have to plead a little bit of ignorance. I'm not exactly sure how the recount process goes for a school election like this, but again, we're talking about 3 votes.
So what were your other big takeaways, especially when it came to the bonds? Nobody else got one passed. Across the entire state, correct?
No, that's not exactly true. There were a couple of smaller ones around the state that did pass.
Okay.
But you have to go to Post Falls to find one. And then you have to go to Murtaugh. They had a very small bond issue for athletic facilities. But yes, we're talking about bond issues in Cassia County, had a fairly large proposal. Minidoka County, closer to home here, Payette had a proposal that really struggled. I don't think they even got to the 50% mark, much less the 2/3 supermajority.
I guess what I'm getting at, Kevin, is that supermajority, though. So, I mean, is that the problem? But you said even some of them didn't get to 50%.
It's a problem in some districts, in some communities where you can see the numbers came pretty close. I think I think Oneida County, which is way off in the southeast corner of the state, they had a bond issue that I think they got about 65, 66%, just shy of that 2/3 supermajority, that threshold that Valley View barely passed.
Yeah, they're 3.
Oneida County came pretty close to passing. So you wonder what a district like that does when they've come so close. Do they come back with a different kind of proposal? Do they tweak it in some manner? Contrast that, as long as we're talking about the far southeast corner of the state.
Yeah.
Bear Lake County had a $48 million proposal, I think it was. Aging schools, one has seismic issues.
Oh my.
That's a seismic area. I mean,
sure. That's a real issue.
That proposal got 17% support.
Oh.
And, it kind of, begs the question, what do you do when you've proposed something that has been so overwhelmingly rejected by the patrons? I mean, where do you go from there? I mean, you may be facing some, as you see, really serious concerns. I mean, if you're talking about seismic issues, that's,
health and safety
trivial.
of children.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see what they do. It'll be interesting to see what Oneida County does. It'll be interesting, closer to home, to see what Payette does with its proposal. They were looking at some aging schools in Payette that they wanted to replace. But again, didn't really come close to that 2/3 threshold. So we'll see where they go from here.
Well, if you would like to see an entire breakdown, Idaho Education News, idahoednews.org, has done a fabulous job seeing where things passed and where things failed, and a little snippet kind of with each school district about what they were looking for. So if you'd like to see that complete rundown, you can go to their website.
It was a big election day.
It was.
48 school districts across the state had either a bond issue or a levy, or in some cases both.
And it didn't get as much play probably here in the Treasure Valley because there weren't as many.
Because most of the big districts really didn't have anything on the ballot. Boise, West Ada, and Nampa. Valley View, by far the biggest district in this area that had a bond issue. CUNA had a supplemental levy, a renewal of a supplemental levy, which passed. So yes, I think for the most part in the Treasure Valley, most patrons didn't have an election in their neighborhood, but for a lot of communities, this was a big election day, and the results are, for a community like Valley View that maybe looks like they're going to get some funding for schools, that's a big deal. For school districts that were really looking for that help on Tuesday, now have to figure out what to do and what to do from here. Pretty important election.
Exactly. Well, we appreciate you covering it, helping us cover it as well. You want to give any predictions before we wrap up about when you actually will depart from the State House?
It was interesting again when we heard legislative leadership talking about that I think the plan has always been to try to get out the latter part of March. Rumblings that it may be the early part of April now, and it's not the school funding formula that will keep this legislature in town until April. It could very definitely be the Medicaid expansion issue. That's something that the legislature is going to have to address, and it has budgetary implications. Not necessarily for this coming year, but for years down the road, the expansion of Medicaid could have some major budgetary implications. So it's an issue that the legislature is looking at very closely. It's unclear what that path is going to look like at this point, and in turn what that path to adjournment is. We may get to a point where this becomes a session about Medicaid expansion and a legislative endgame that's really focused on Medicaid and not so much on education. But
we'll see when that shift happens.
We'll see when and if that shift happens, because it's also possible that while the legislature is working on Medicaid expansion, you may see other issues sort of come back to life, or kind of continue to lurk around on the side.
We'll see. If we only had a crystal ball.
If only.
Kevin, thank you for being here, for making the grade. Appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them here below as well. Thanks for being here, everybody.